He's the rabbi of Oak Park, the shul where I'm going. And he's a rabbi, right-handed Rabbi Brisky. I don't know if anything would be happening without Rabbi Levine.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me here. So there's been several times that Alina had mentioned that over the course of the classes that she gives, there's always these questions, which are very, very common questions amongst Jewish people, particularly in this generation. The questions go like, where does it say in the Torah that you have to do this? People today in this generation, they want to follow what's written in the Torah. And yet, when you look at Judaism, you find that there are so many things that are not even mentioned in the Torah. And you hear terms like, that's what the rabbi said, that's what's written in the Talmud. And one that actually looks into the Talmud finds that it's completely filled with arguments, thousands of arguments of rabbis. So, the question is it Torah or is it not Torah? Is this what God wants of us or God doesn't care? If rabbis have certain opinions, then perhaps rabbis in this generation will have other opinions. Or there are questions like, where does it say in the Torah about separate meat and dairy? Where does it say in the Torah how you get married? Where in the Torah does it describe what tefillin are? Where in the Torah does it say what a mezuzah is? Where in the Torah does it say anything about observing the holiday of Hanukkah and Purim, which happened after the giving of the Torah? So really the overarching theme of tonight's class is really how the Torah was developed. Like everything else in life, God created an imperfect world, and He expects man to perfect it. God created man imperfect, because in order to be a mensch, it's up to you to perfect that which God created. And very similar is really the development of Torah. But before we get into the whole development of Torah, and I think it's a very important class that you have a picture of how the Torah was passed from one generation to the second, and how it evolved, we need to ask ourselves a question. What makes us as Jewish people so certain that our religion is the right one? Today there are thousands of religions. And each religion is holding on to their Bible and claiming that this is the one and only. This is the true one. This is the genuine one. All the religions look at their prophets and say, our prophet is the one that communicated with God. So what makes Judaism different than any other religion? And if we don't have an answer to that question, then we're on very shaky grounds. What makes Judaism different than any other religion? Because what we hold is the word of God, they hold is the word of God. Anybody want to take a guess at that? What makes us different? Why?
Millions of people experience that.
Millions of people experience. That's right. Every other religion is all based upon the testimony of one individual. So either he's right when he came out of that cave and said, God spoke to me, or he was having a bad day and he was hallucinating. Who knows? But when it comes to Judaism, if you look at the Bible, what does the Bible say? The Bible says that all the Israelites were taken out of Egypt with Moses. And there was a splitting of the sea in which the entire Jewish people experienced. And then they were brought to the foot of the mountain, and God came down and revealed himself to everyone. So just for a moment, we have to think about that. How would the Jewish religion be not authentic? In other words, how did it come about that the Jewish people accepted this Bible as being the true Bible if it never really happened? At what point in history did somebody try to play a hoax on the Jewish people and say, here's the Bible, we all have to accept it, if it never really happened? You know, 2,000 years ago is definitely the Torah existed. We know that from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So at what point did somebody try to play this game with the Jewish people and try for them to accept the Torah if it didn't really happen? Everybody would have been so skeptical by opening up the Torah and seeing that the entire Jewish nation witnessed and experienced God. Unless that actually happened, nobody would accept it. In fact, we look at our acceptance of Judaism and our acceptance of God and our acceptance of the Torah, not one that requires faith, but one that requires knowledge. Meaning that as much as it's knowledge that makes you accept that George Washington is the first president. After all, nobody here actually experienced it. But how do we know that George Washington was the first president? How do we know that 1789 was the inauguration? What's the answer? The answer is because if it passed through all these generations and nobody raised red flags saying, what are you talking about? My father told me that his father told him, that his grandfather told him not to believe in this George Washington because he lived then, and nobody named George Washington ever existed in America. That never happened. So it's really knowledge that really we're accepting Judaism. In other words, if we are true and honest to ourselves, there are certain things that we don't really require faith, but there's enough reason for us to accept it in our minds to say that it's true. It's almost as if somebody else has to prove the other way. So if we're honest, we would say that just as we're accepting George Washington, we're accepting that Judaism actually is a religion, people that had gone out of Egypt, that had received the Torah at Sinai, and that makes us different than any other religion because we were all there. The entire Jewish people experienced it. So, based on that, let's try to understand what happened at Sinai and what Moses' role is. Because unlike other religions, where most of their acceptance is because of their prophet, we as Jewish people did not accept Judaism because of our prophet Moses. Jewish people are the same. We're cynical. In fact, at the very first time that Moses had that experience at the burning bush when God told him, go back to Egypt and stand up to Pharaoh and tell the Jewish people that they are going to be taken out of Egypt, what did Moses tell God right there standing in front of the burning bush? It says that in the Bible. They won't believe me. And we didn't. And in fact, during the duration of Moses coming to Egypt and facing Pharaoh and telling the Jewish people that God is going to be taking them out of Egypt, they kept on questioning him. Oh, right, Moses. Sure, Moses. You should see a therapist, Moses. And he turned to God and said, they don't believe me. And God said, when they will come to the mountain, they will believe you. In other words, yes, they're not going to believe you. There'll be a lot of cynicism. But when they'll come to the mountain, then they'll believe you. Why? Because as Moses was telling them that he's having communication with God, and God is telling him that the Jewish people are going to be leaving Egypt, and they were like raising their eyebrows. And he takes them out of Egypt, and they still don't believe in him. But once they saw the experience at Sinai, and if you look at the story, you'll see there's one thing very strange right before God revealed himself to the entire people. And that is that God told Moses, come up on the mountain. so that I can talk to you and that the entire Jewish people can hear our conversation. Why did God have to do that? So that the Jewish people could say, oh my God, he was saying the truth. So when Moses went up the mountain before God revealed himself, and then God began to talk to Moses and said, are you sure that the Jewish people are willing to accept and all of the precepts and all of the commandments in the Torah? Go find out if they're willing to accept it before I come and give them the Torah. And then as Moses was coming down, they already met him at the foot of the mountain, and they all already said the famous words, Nasa, we're going to do it all. We heard the conversation between God and you. See, this is the story that's written in the Bible that all the Jewish people experienced. That's a little hard to fabricate. It's a little hard to hoax the Jewish people if that actually didn't happen. Because at some point, if this is all a hoax, at some point somebody had to come to the entire Jewish people and say, you see this Bible? You need to accept all of these commandments. And they'll look at this fellow and say, what are you talking about? Look, the Bible that God gave us with Moses, he took us out of Egypt. And everyone would be looking at each other, what are you talking about? Did you ever hear something like that? Did your grandfather ever tell you anything like that? Nobody heard about it. We wouldn't accept it. We accept it because it actually happened. And that's what makes Judaism different than any other religion. So, let's understand that Moses received validity from the Jewish people. In other words, he now became valid. We believe in him. Because at Sinai, we heard God speaking to him. That was it. So it's like, if you're working in a warehouse for some big company, for Microsoft, and of course Bill Gates never comes to the warehouse, but the manager one time tells everyone in the warehouse that Bill Gates had lunch with Bill Gates, and he wants things changed in the warehouse, and they all look at the manager as if he's out of his mind, as if he had lunch with Bill Gates, the warehouse manager. They laughed at him. 2 weeks later on, he said, Bill Gates wants to know if those new instructions were kept. And they all laugh at him. He's getting upset. Look who thinks he's having lunch with Bill Gates. And then one day, Bill Gates actually comes to the warehouse, comes inside, goes over to the manager, speaks to the manager, and says, who doesn't believe that I've been giving you instructions? Who is it? That's exactly what happened. So we did not believe in Moses. We don't believe in Judaism and Torah because Moses simply told us that he communicated with God. We know because we saw God speaking to him. Now that God spoke to him, now when the warehouse manager comes back the next week and says, by the way, Bill Gates, we had another lunch and he wants another change in the warehouse, everybody's listening. Because he proved himself. So, what happened at Sinai is number one. The Jewish people, yes, they experienced the 10 Commandments. That's it. They didn't hear the whole Torah. They didn't hear all 613 commandments. God revealed himself to everyone. The 10 Commandments were said. And then the following day, Moses went up the mountain for 40 days. Now, yes, when he came down with the tablets and the knowledge of the Torah, so of course, you had a few thousand Jews that were sinning with the golden calf. I mean, that just shows us that we really didn't change that much. I mean, right after this whole event that we saw God openly, we still gave in to our cravings. We're still as cynical as ever. Moses came down the mountain holding onto the tablets. He broke the tablets because of the sin of the golden calf. But then he went back up in the mountain. But what was he doing there for those 40 days? It says that he didn't eat any food. He didn't drink any water. He was like an angel. He lived like an angel. What did he do up for 40 days? He went to receive the Torah. That's what we say. And what do we mean by the Torah? Well, we mean of course, those tablets that contain the 10 Commandments, but also the knowledge of the Torah, because when he came down, he began to tell them commandments that God had told him to give over to them. And why do we believe him? Because he's valid. Because we all saw God speaking to him. So when Moses said that these are the commandments that God is giving us, then we're accepting it. We have no reason why we shouldn't. So we have the 10 Commandments, and then we have Moses' knowledge of the Torah that he learned by God, and when he came down, he began to write the Torah. And throughout those years in the wilderness, he continued to communicate with God, and the events that were transpiring was then written down in the Torah by Moses, and new commandments were given, and Moses wrote it like a secretary that is just transcribing word for word of what the Torah should be written. Now, at this point, if you say, well, how do you know? Maybe Moses, wrote it on his own. If that's not enough proof that everyone saw him speak to God, then you're right, you have a problem. But we're accepting that when Moses said, these are the words that God wants written in the Torah, we're going to accept it. Now, in addition to that, Moses was given, aside from all of the commandments, all 613 commandments that he ultimately wrote in the Torah, he was also given basic principles. What are the basic principles? Meaning that God gave him a way in which laws can be extracted from Torah. Not 100% every situation is going to be clearly elucidated in the Torah. There has to be a method that if there's a question, then follow these ways in which we are going to extract laws of the Torah. So there are 13 different ways in which the Torah, we can expound on the Torah and come to a definitive law. How do we know that these are the right principles? Because Moses told us that these are the right principles of how to be able to come up with new laws. We don't have new laws meaning more commandments, but I'll give you an example. One of the ways of expounding the Torah is that if you see something that applies when you see something that applies, let's say, to a holiday, a restriction that applies to a holiday, well, a Sabbath is a lot stricter than a holiday, so it definitely applies to the Sabbath as well. It's known as kal v'chomer. Kal means lighter, chomer means heavier. If I can pick up 100 pounds, I can definitely pick up 50 pounds. So God told Moses, anything in the Torah that you ever see, something that is ruled upon on something that is more lighter, then you can definitely apply it to something that is more heavier, something that is more stricter. So why couldn't God tell us just everything open in the Torah? In other words, that we don't need this method to be able to come up with our own laws, with our own rulings. Let God just simply state exactly what we need to know. So number one is that Torah is not meant just for that generation. As we know, the word Torah, like the word Mora, what does Mora mean? Teacher. Which Torah is a teaching. It's meant for all generations. It's not some primitive, old-fashioned, archaic set of rules that only apply to a generation thousands of years ago. The Torah is meant for us to live by no matter what generation. How modern the generation is, the Torah still applies to us. Therefore, there are many things that haven't yet come to be. So what God is going to talk about cloning procedures, or God is going to talk about euthanasia thousands of years ago. There has to be principles in which we can determine what the laws are so that in the generation that we're living, we have an applicable Torah. We'll soon get to that process of how the generation comes up with a ruling. But obviously not everything is going to be written down. That's number one. Number two, as I mentioned beforehand, that God created the world so that we can be partners. Because the ultimate giving of God is that we have the ability to be able to be like Him, to create, to produce, to be able to feel productive, that we shouldn't be over here just as recipients. That's the nature of everything in the world, of how God created it, because ultimately, when we are able to perfect the world, and we're able to invent things, and we're able to produce in the world, then that's the ultimate satisfaction that we can have in this world, and therefore, that's what God wanted. God wanted to give us a world in which we can be just like Him. We can be givers, not just takers. So therefore, the Torah as well is something that He's giving us to be able to develop, to be able to come to conclusive ends, to come to rulings in each generation, because that is the nature of how God created the world and why God created the world. So, what we have in the Torah is all of the words and the verses that Moses wrote down. And that's known as the 5 books of Moses. The 5 books of Moses basically is everything word for word that Moses transcribed from God Himself in order to be able to give to the Jewish people. Every single letter is subject to scrutiny because we don't believe that it was Moses' words, it's God's words. You can analyze it, you can say, why did God choose this word and not that word? Why is there an extra letter in the word? Why is there a letter missing in the word? Why is there a letter that's too big or too small, or so on and so forth? Because we believe that everything that Moses wrote down, the 5 books of Moses, was given to him word for word by God, and he just transcribed everything. However, when he went up the mountain for the 40 days, it wasn't just the principles. It doesn't take 40 days to know the 13 principles of how to be able to expound and extract rulings of Torah. He was taught all of the interpretations. What does that mean? That means that when you look at the Torah, and God gives us a commandment like, write a mezuzah on every doorpost. That's what it says in the Shema. All of your doors, gates, and your home should have a mezuzah. But the Torah doesn't say what a mezuzah is. It would almost be foolish to think that God just gave us a Torah, but He didn't give any interpretation, because then we would be twiddling our thumbs thinking, oh, what is a mezuzah? He's telling us to put a mezuzah on our door, but He doesn't tell us what it is. And I can go on and on and on with all of these commandments. What does He mean by this? What does He mean about putting totafot by our eyes and by our heart? What does that mean? So obviously there has to be some type of explanation. So when Moses went up in the mountain, in addition to learning about the 13 ways of extracting new rulings in the Torah, he also learned the interpretation of the Torah. Meaning, he came down the mountain, and actually the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, tells us this, that there were 3 times that he actually taught the entire Jewish people all of the interpretations of the Torah during those 40 years in the wilderness. And then right before he died, he had the Torah written up 13 times, and that each of the tribes went ahead and took one of the scrolls of the 5 books of Moses, and the 13th he placed in the ark that accompanied the sanctuary that traveled with them. So the interpretation is what we know as the oral Torah. Let's talk a little bit about the oral Torah. Because the oral Torah, which is the interpretation of the words of the Torah, were orally, verbally given over to Moses, for Moses to give over verbally, orally to the Jewish people. And in fact, for 1,000 years, that interpretation that we know as the oral Torah was verbally transmitted from generation to generation. Why did God want this interpretation of Torah verbally transmitted, as opposed to, why don't you just write it all down? Why should it be an oral Torah? So the explanation is that God wanted that the Jewish people should have the Torah. But God also knew that the nations of the world are going to take the Torah and take it for themselves. In fact, as we know, during the times of right after the Greek Empire, we know there was the Egyptian Empire, the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the Persian, the Greek, and then the Romans. So after the Greek Empire, with Alexander the Great, afterwards there was the Roman Empire. But there was a lot of Greek philosophy. There was still a lot of Greek influence in the world. And as we know the history, that the Greeks took 70 scholars of Israel and placed them in different different rooms and told them to write word for word the Torah in Greek. They want the Torah. If you look at Wikipedia, this is known as the Septuagint. So if you look at the Wikipedia about the Torah, in other words, where the source of the Torah is, it's written in Hebrew and in Greek, and from there everybody got it. So the Septuagint, which is the Torah that the 5 books of Moses that was translated in Greek, and all of the sages, word for word, wrote out the Torah, and they saw that it was completely uniform. Now they have the Torah that the Jewish people received. And then it began to disseminate because more people in that generation knew Greek. So people started translating into other languages. But all they have are the 5 books of Moses, which is really just a shell. All of the interpretation was orally transmitted from Moses to the generation, and from generation to the next generation. For 1,000 years, we've been holding on to really the entire interpretation to the Jewish people, that by the time it ended up being written down already, I mean, of course, today it's all written down, but over 1,000 years, it was orally transmitted. They don't have those interpretations. That's why, every pastor, minister, every imam, they're only just quoting verses and verses and verses, but the truth of the matter is they have no idea of the bigger picture. They don't understand what the meanings behind it, what the interpretations are, what the relevance of our lives are. All of that is all part of the oral Torah. And the oral Torah is known as the Pardes, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in the class. There are different levels of interpretation of the Torah, meaning that there's a simple way of understanding it, but then every single verse has hints that it's hinting upon, which has additional information for us. And then we have those other rules and traditions that we have that came about from the 13 methods of expounding the Torah that I spoke about beforehand. That's known as the drush. The drush, it says, Shlosh Esrei Midot Shahatorah Nidreshet. 13 principles in which the Torah is expounded upon. That's known as Nidreshet, means the drush. So every single word in the Torah has a literal meaning. That's what everybody has. Yes, the thousands of Bibles that there are today, they all have the simple interpretation. That's known as a pshat. But then you have what something is alluding to. And this oral transmission of what it's alluding to. I'll give you an example. There's a word that is used very, very often in the Torah, and it's a 2-letter word. It's known as et, aleph taf. It doesn't mean anything. The whole Torah could have been without that word et. The very first verse in the Torah is Bereshit bara Elokim. In the beginning, God created et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, the heaven and the earth. Why couldn't the Torah simply say Bereshit bara Elokim? In the beginning, God created hashamayim ve'haaretz, the heaven and the earth. There's no meaning behind the word et. Or I'll give you another familiar one. One of the 10 commandments. Kabed et avicha ve'et imecha. Honor your father and your mother. What's the et for? Kabed avicha v'imecha. Could have said it in 3 words. There's nothing that it adds. What is the et? Every single one of the ets have an explanation behind them, something that it's hinting upon. We have that. The nations of the world don't have that. Kabed et avicha v'et imecha. You know what the two ets are that Moses told the Jewish people? By the way, he went like this. Shh, be quiet. The 2 ets over there are parents that raised you, even though they're not your biological parent. You also have a responsibility of honoring them, and also an elder sibling. Those are the 2 ets. Every single et in the Torah. When Adam and Eve had their first 2 sons, Cain and Hevel, Cain and Abel, what does it say? It says that she became pregnant, and who was born? Et Cain ve'et Hevel. What's going on? What's the et? They each had a twin sister. Oh, okay. That explains how the world became populated if there were only 2 boys. So you have no idea of how much of this hinting there is in the Torah. And then you have the deeper dimension, is known as the Sod, which is the mystical aspect of Torah, which is the hidden aspect in Torah, which is the Kabbalah. Kabbalah is part of Torah too. Because Kabbalah is the knowledge of the oral transmission of Torah, of this deepest dimension of Torah. In fact, all of the spiritual concepts are not mentioned in the Torah openly. Where does it talk about soul? Where does it talk about heaven? Where does it talk about afterlife? Where does it talk about reincarnation? Doesn't say anywhere in the Torah. But it's all hinted in the verses. It's like a code. And behind these words, behind these verses, are these explanations. So when we say Kabbalah, sure, that's Torah. Medrash, sure, that's Torah. Because the Medrash are all those things on that 3rd level, that the 13 principles that the Torah expounds upon. That's the Medrash part of Torah. It's all part of the oral Torah. So we have the written Torah, and now we have the oral Torah. And all these interpretations were given over from one generation to the next generation for 1,000 years. We'll get to why they decided to write it down. But for 1,000 years, it was given over from generation to generation. So now I'm asking you for a moment to think about using your mind and being truly honest. If you were living at that time period, and you wanted to make sure that this oral transmission is going to be secure from generation to generation, what would you do? Because these teachings are really the entire interpretation of the Torah. So how would you go about securing this interpretation of Torah that was told that you can write it down, but you have to orally transmit it?
Teach your kids.
You would teach your children, right? You will make sure that every single generation have leaders that are responsible, that they are the oral Torah transmitter responsible people of that generation. I mean, we would ensure that there are people put into place, that they have one responsibility, making sure that the oral Torah is transmitted from generation to generation. And you would want to be as meticulous and precise as possible. But we have that in Judaism. Just like George Washington, just to give an example. We're able to trace down from president to president, from generation to generation, exactly who succeeded and so on and so forth. We have dates, we have numbers, we have people and so on. We have that too here in Judaism, and that's why I included after the first 2 pages, which we're not going to go into right now. But what's fascinating, which I found, and it's written in many places, in Maimonides lived around 900 years ago, and he was a famous codifier of Jewish law. He's the one that actually took a lot of the oral law and finally brought it into definitive law. And in his introduction, all of these pages here, these first 4 pages, he goes and explains how the oral Torah was transmitted from generation to generation. The names of the people. And we know those names because we have that history book. In other words, what I'm trying for you to understand is that as good as a history book is, that you're willing to accept that these things happened, you have to accept this as well. For the very least, it's a history book. Not to say that everything in your history books are 100% accurate, but you don't need faith. When you're in 5th grade and 6th grade and 7th grade and you're learning world history, you're learning American history or Russian history, whatever you want to, not everything in the history book is 100%. There have been times that things were found out later on, and then the new revised history books that were going into the schools now, had to omit certain facts because they were found out to be untrue. Nothing is 100%, but don't tell me that the people in Russia, when they're sitting down as students, they all had faith in what they were told. They have no faith. They're learning it. That's knowledge. In other words, there's a certain amount of logic in your mind that tells you you don't really need faith for this. This is pretty much something that you can reason with. Not 100%, but you can reason with it. So for the very least, the Torah is a history book, a very precise one with dates, with names of who was the individual that was carrying this responsibility of taking all of those interpretations known as the oral Torah and transmitting it from one generation to generation. We have a very, very precise list. For 2,000 years, we have a precise list of how it was carried over from one generation to the next generation. So yes, there was a role of a king in Judaism. Yes, there was a role of a nasi, of a president or a prince. Yes, there was a Kohen Gadol, there was a high priest that had a function amongst the Jewish people. There were different leadership roles throughout the ages. But there was always people that had one responsibility: make sure that the oral Torah is transmitted properly from generation to generation. So let's just look a little bit, and I'm not going to waste too much time over here. Number 1, all the commandments that were given to Moses at Sinai were given together with their interpretation. As it is written, and I will give thee the tablets of stone and the law and the commandments. so God didn't just give them the stone of the 10 commandments that were written that they all experienced at Sinai, but the law and the commandments. Law is the written law, commandments is the interpretation. That's what God said to the Jewish people. He's giving them all 3: the stone, the law, and the commandments. Meaning, Moses wrote down the 5 books of Moses, and then the oral Torah. Those are the 3 things. We were commanded to fulfill the law according to the commandment, and this commandment is what we call the oral law. The whole of the law was written down by Moses, our teacher, before he died, in his own hand. And again, Moses has validity because we all saw him talking to God. You want to refute that? Well, then there's not much you're going to believe in unless you actually see it with your own eyes. But Moses was the one that actually wrote the 5 books of Moses before he died. He gave a scroll of the law to each tribe, and he put the other scroll aside by the ark for a witness. Remember, I told you that he instructed that 13 copies should be made before he died. 1 each tribe has, and 1 should be in the ark. As it's written, take this book of the law and put it by the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against thee. Okay. But the commandment, which is the interpretation of the law, he did not write it down. The oral law he didn't write down, but gave orders concerning it to the elders, to Yehoshua, and to all the rest of Israel, as it's written. All this word which I command you, that shall ye observe to do. Deuteronomy, for this reason, is called the oral law. And you start going down then You see, go to 5. Many elders received it from Yoshua, and Eli received it from the elders and from Pinchas. Shmuel received it from Eli and his court, and David received it from Shmuel and his court. Aliyah the Shilonite was amongst those who came out of Egypt, and was a Levite, and had heard it from Moses, but was young in Moses' times, and he received it from David and his court. Elijah, when he was living as a physical prophet of Israel, received it from Achia Hashiloni. Elisha received it from Eliyahu. I mean, what more do you want? And we have these people in the history book that we have as part of our Tanakh. This is the Jewish history. We're mentioning names here. Names give validity. When you mention a name, you're showing that, you know what I mean, you're willing to stand up. We're not just saying it was passed down. There were people that accepted it. The people that had responsibility of transmitting it from one generation. We have the name. All of this. Number 7, Ezra's court is called the Men of Great Assembly. There were Chagai, Zechariah, Michaliah, and Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Nehemiah. All these people, we know their stories. We have all of this, how they received it, and they passed it over from one generation to the next generation. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, number 9, had 5 students. He passed it over to the next generation. You know, I remember there was once a professor that was here that used to work for NASA. He passed away a few years ago. He was a secular Jew that became a Baal Teshuvah. All of a sudden he started keeping Torah and mitzvot later on in his life. His name is Professor Velvel Green, and he worked for NASA. So he told a story. We brought him several times to lecture here at the Kneu Jewish Academy, and he tells a story that once he was asked to be together with other professors in a think tank. You know what a think tank is? When big minds of the generation are trying to figure out a solution to something, they put a bunch of people in this think tank and they said, we're not leaving until we come up with the solution. And he was part of it. And the nature of the discussion was that they wanted to send a group of astronauts to the closest star. It never happened yet. We send men to the moon, but to the closest star, it would take generations. Alpha Centauri. That's the name of the star. And they were trying to figure out in the think tank, how is this going to work? Why? What's the problem? The problem is that you're going to send the astronauts, that they're going to have children, so the astronauts know what the mission is. They know of Earth. They know of being sent off from Earth, but they're going to have to continue now to the next generation. And then their children have to pass it over to the next generation. Because once they get to this star, they have to know what the mission is. Eventually, they got to come back. They have to give us all the information. So how do we ensure that this mission should be one that is that will be passed over, without children saying, how do I know that there's an Earth? This is life. This is the whole reality. Who says there was once an Earth? Grandpa, he died already. He's out of his mind. You know, how do we pass it on? So they looked at him and they asked him the following question. He was the only Jew from the group of scientists and professors. They said, you tell us, how did Judaism pass it from one generation to the next generation? If there's one people that have the answer to this question, are the Jewish people. So the idea, let's say, that, okay, so what do they do in Judaism? Well, there's a Torah. Torah tells us what the mission is. Let's write down, there'll be a document called the Torah. And we'll have to make sure that every Mondays and Thursdays we'll take out this document and we're going to read the mission every single week. And then on Saturday we're going to read a portion of it because it's too lengthy. And this should continue to take place every single week. They began to talk about how Judaism has transmitted from one generation to the next in order to keep the mission till eternity. And that's what we have. In other words, and I ask you to think about, if you were there and you had a way that you can be involved in securing this Torah and this oral transmission from one generation to the next, how would you do it better than it was done? And the answer is nobody has a better solution. So if you have the time, you can look at these 4 pages of 2,000 years of how the oral transmission was transmitted from one generation to the next. Now let's continue. Okay. Then God told us, so we have the interpretation. What a mezuzah is, it means a parchment, and it has to be written down by a scribe, and he has to write the letters, and the letters can't touch each other, and it has to go on the right side. All of that is part of the oral Torah of what a mezuzah is. So when the nations of the world says, and you should write down a mezuzah on your doorpost, they don't have the explanation. Today, they can look on the internet and they can know what a mezuzah is. But for over 1,000 years, they didn't have that. And now it's lost. It's, the religion's already developed. Somebody's not all of a sudden going to start coming in. We missed all of the interpretations. Now all they have is that book known to them as the Old Testament for some of them, or God's Word, and they have the thousands of copies, and that's what the whole religion is based upon. But the real richness of how, first of all, how the explanations of the commandments and the messages of the stories in the Torah, the narratives of this of the Torah, how it applies to our lives, and the deeper dimension of understanding life and the world that God created, of what the significance of our following the commandments, what it achieves, what changes when we put up a mezuzah. That whole spiritual dimension of the soul and connecting with God and what goes on in the spiritual realms, which is all found in the Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, that is the richness of the Torah. It's not the words, it's not the shell itself. Now I mentioned to you that we're going to be talking about, so how are they going to rule in a generation that something new was found, something new was discovered, something new is now applicable, and it was never applicable until now, and now we have a question about what does Judaism say about this. So in the 5 books of Moses, God tells the Jewish people, one of the commandments, that they have to set up courts of justice. In every single locale, there was a court system known as a bet din. A bet din means a court. And there were Jewish judges. Every small locale had a small little court system that had 3 judges. Because 3 judges were able to rule on small cases, like monetary questions. Then there was a court system of 21. And they can rule over life and death cases. In other words, murder, things like that. You would need 21 judges to rule, and then you would have the Supreme Court known as the Sanhedrin, that would be 71, and that was in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin, for most of Jewish history until the destruction of the Second Temple. So these courts that were all over for thousands of years until the destruction of the Second Temple, where God tells us that if there is a dispute, understand that you have to base your ruling on the words of the Torah. The Torah is like the Constitution. Just like you have lawyers today, there's times that there are questions that are brought up in court that we're not sure exactly what the law of the land is. So the lawyers have to go ahead and present the case based on rules of the Constitution, based on wording of the Constitution. That's what they do. They take the Constitution and they try to get support to their claim of what they want the ruling to be. So the way that we're supposed to rule has to be based on the principles and the wording and the interpretation and so on and so forth. But obviously, there'll be times in which one will say, hey, I think that the law should be this, and I'm basing it on this principle. And then somebody else, another rabbi, is going to go ahead and say, I think it should be the opposite, and I can base it on this principle. What do you do in such a case like that? Just like you have with lawyers. There's going to be gray areas or newfound things in the world that they need to rule upon. It has to be based upon the things that are in existence already. So God tells us that we have to establish these courts of justice, and that ultimately there has to be rulings. The reason why there's always 3, 21, 71, it always has to be majority rules. In almost every case. That's why it has those numbers. So here is what's written in Deuteronomy on the bottom of the page. If a matter is hidden from you, matters of dispute in your cities, you shall do according to the word that they will tell you, and you shall be careful to do everything that they will teach you. According to the teaching that they will teach you, shall you do. You shall not deviate from the word that they will tell you, right or left. So, there comes a question that has to be presented now to the court system. And then you have all of these rabbis that are there, that are appointed from the people, to be the experts of knowledge, to be able to rule on these things like every society. They make their cases, they present their arguments, they bring their support of the verses or the interpretation, and then they take a vote, and majority is followed, and God says, you shall not deviate from that ruling, not to the left and not to the right. In other words, you have to consider it that this is Torah law. Because that's part of the system that God wants us to establish. So when there are new things of today, cloning issues, the same thing is done today with cloning issues. In the very, very traditional religious communities, we all know who the experts are that are living in this generation, that are known to be authorities in Jewish ruling when it comes to end-of-life issues or it comes to science. Science, they come together, they make rulings, and everybody accepts them. Whatever their rulings come to, we accept it. We don't deviate, not to the left and not to the right, because that's what's written in the 5 books of Moses. Now we turn to the next page.
Can I have a question?
Huh?
So, and the question arises here because a lot of people are saying that the Torah is written by people, right?
Hold on. So, let me just finish up over here, and then we'll open to questions.
Okay.
I'm not going to take too much long, maybe 15 minutes. And then, I did it in such a way that it should be just as simple as possible for you to see kind of the basic picture of how the Torah was transmitted from generation to generation. So, let's get to the point. What happened right after the destruction of the Second Temple? The destruction of the Second Temple happened in the year 70 CE by the Romans. So we had, just to give you an idea of a timeline here, is that the Jewish people, they left Egypt in the year 2448 in the Jewish calendar. 2448, spent 40 years in wandering in the desert. They entered Israel 2488. Okay, so now for 40 years, they've been transmitting the oral Torah for 40 years. Then, just roughly, 500 years later on, the first temple was standing. So now 540 years, they're transmitting the oral Torah from generation to generation. How long did the first temple last? 410 years. 910 plus the 40, 950 years. It's transmitting 950 years, transmitting from one generation to another generation. Then there was 70 years in between. First and second temple, 950 and 70 is 1,020. The second temple stood for how long? 420 years. 1,020 and 420 is how much? Is 1,490. 1,500 years. Now we're at the destruction of the Second Temple. For 1,500 years, this has been, Jewish people have done a good job in transmitting this from one generation to the next generation. After the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, there was a terrible, wicked Roman emperor whose name was Hadrian. And he made the Jewish people's lives after the destruction, after the Romans went ahead and destroyed the Second Temple, the period of time for almost 200 years, the Jewish people's lives were threatened and people were killed and they couldn't follow the commandments. And that's where what we read about in the Yom Kippur service, about the great 10 martyrs, great leaders and sages who were brutally tortured by the Romans. One of them, most known, is Rabbi Akiva. He was skinned alive in front of his students. This is the time period, almost about 200 years after the destruction of the temple. So now we're talking about the year around 200, a little bit less than that. So now it's already almost 1700 years since they got the Torah, that it's been transmitted. At that time period, the leader of the Jewish people was a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Judah. Rabbi Judah Hanasi, known as Rebbe. And the Roman Caesar was a man by the name of Antoninus. So you had the Romans' head was Antoninus, Rabbi Yehuda was the head of the Jewish people. The relationship that they had, they were practically best of friends. I mean, there's so much that went into their relationship and stories about the relationship. In fact, just to give you just a small story, and forget about their upbringing, just as when they were babies, when Rabbi Yehuda was a baby and born and circumcised, the Romans that forbid circumcision came to her and commanded that she come to the Roman Empire to show if her son was circumcised, because they were taught, they have intel that her son was circumcised. She was ordered to come there and he would be executed and her. She had a friend, a Roman woman, who happened to have a baby at the same time. And the Roman woman says, "Take my baby and go." That's a sacrifice. And Rabbi Yehuda's mother took the Roman's baby, went to the Roman Caesar and said, "Here's my baby. He's not circumcised." And they let her go. Well, that baby was Antoninus. When she came back, when Rabbi Yehuda's mother came back and spoke to the mother of Antoninus, she says that we're making a pact that these two are going to be bound together as they grow up. So fate had it that Rabbi Yehuda and Antoninus, when they were the leaders of the Jewish and the Romans, there was peace in the land. Rabbi Yehuda immediately gathered all of the greats. Now that time period, by the way, that time period that Rabbi Yehuda was in was the greatest sages that ever lived from before or after was in that time period. I don't know how God blessed that particular generation. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, you heard of him? He was in that generation. Rabbi Yehuda took all of the leaders and said, "Listen here, even though God wanted this oral Torah transmitted, it's been 1700 years. We have a period of time right now that we can write it down. Who knows who the next leader is going to be, and eventually it might be forgotten. Already for 200 years we've been holding on to it, and it's been very, very hard because of the anti-Semitism, because of the persecution that we're going through." He got all the rabbis to agree, let's finally write it down, what the laws are. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that end up, he was wanted by the Romans for execution, and he went into a cave and he wrote the Zohar. It was at that time they say, write it down. You know, Rabbi Shimon he wrote it down before Rabbi Yehuda established. He was in a cave, so he figured that he had divine wisdom to write it down. But Rabbi Yehuda had every single rabbi of his generation agree to write down the Jewish law according to the oral tradition. That is what we call the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah, the sages that are quoted in the Mishnah and argue in the Mishnah, are known as Tanaim. If you ever heard of that word? Tanaim. A Tana. A Tana is a sage that is quoted in the Mishnah. Now, what are the arguments? Yes, the Mishnah is full of arguments. But they're not arguing about what was handed down from generation to generation, and they knew that to be true. For instance, mezuzah, they didn't argue if you need a mezuzah or not. Everyone knew that a mezuzah was required. The question now is about mezuzah. What happens if you have a particular opening in your house? That's not really meant, it wasn't designed as an opening as a door, but you happen to use it to go into your house. Does that need a mezuzah or not? What type of home needs a mezuzah? What type of room needs a mezuzah? From the transmission of the Torah, of the oral Torah, it says 4 amot by 8 amot, which is roughly, let's say, about 36 square feet. But what happens if you have a room? If it's 36 square feet, what happens if you have a room that's 2 feet wide and 18 feet high? Does that need? They're arguing. It's a very practical law today. If you have this little room like a broom closet or something, do you need a mezuzah there or not? So if it's 4 by 8, if it's at least 4 by 8, you know definitely you need it. But let's say it's 3 by 12. And you have those type of rooms. Do you need a mezuzah or not? Because according to the old transmission, it has to be 4 cubits by 8 cubits. So what about a different configuration? So they're arguing over it, and they're coming to an end. Again, how I explained to you how they come to an end. They each give their explanation. They give each their support from the Torah, and then they rule, and then we find out who the majority is, and we make the ruling there. So the entire Mishnah, of course, it's full of arguments, but there's not one argument. If God wanted every Jewish man at 13 years old to put a tefillin on every single day, nobody argued about that. Nobody argued about separation of meat and milk. Nobody argued that every single doorway needs a mezuzah. They're arguing about hypothetical things in those areas. So they put down the law in the Mishnah, and then comes the arguments. What happens here? What happens here? What happens in such a case? In this case, that's what the arguments are. And that is the period of time. Again, the sages of that time were second to none. They were extremely gifted. They were the greatest sages that ever lived. They are known as the Tanaim. And at a certain point, they said, we're stopping the generation. We're closing off. That there's nobody after this point that can argue with anybody of the Tanaim. The next generation, and if you look over here, you see over here, Zugot, by the way, Zugot were known in the time before, when they still had the courts of justice. So the Sanhedrin were 71. But there were 2 leaders, two heads of the Sanhedrin, known as the Zugot, the peers. The Nasi and the Av Bet Din. Nasi means he was like the president, and the head of the court, those were known as the Zug, the peers, and they, were over the entire Sanhedrin, which is the supreme court system. So that period of time, it was the Zugot that had the say if there was any arguments and needed a ruling about. Afterwards were the Tanaim. The Tanaim were living during the time of the Mishnah. Remember here, until about 250 years after CE, after the Common Era, that's when the Mishnah. Then they said that's it. Nobody can ever argue with the Tana again because the generation doesn't have the same grasp and the same sage understanding like this generation, and then became the Talmudic era. The Talmudic era now took the Mishnah, and now the sages began to argue on things that the Tanaim did not speak about. There began more questions. But those sages in the Talmud are now called Amoraim. Amora is one, Amoraim. And Amora was not allowed to argue with any Tana. You understand? In other words, what was established by the Tanaim were accepted, that nobody could ever argue. You can bring support from a Tana, but you cannot argue with a Tana forever. That's it. The era of the Mishnah was over, and now with the Talmudic time period, And that lasted for a few hundred years. You see, between from 250 until about 500. That's when the Amoraim of the Talmudic time period, and then they closed that off, and they said that the next generation cannot argue with the Amoraim. You see, that's the way we made sure that we're not going to have some rabbi from this generation that is going to go ahead and say, well, the Mishnah says this way, I'm a rabbi, I say something different. There's no such a thing. Because if you allow that to happen, then you're playing with fire in Judaism. You're playing with fire because every rabbi can get up and say, well, I argue with the guy in the Mishnah. 100 years after the Mishnah period, nobody can argue with them. Now you're arguing with them, thousands of years later. This is how they secured that when the oral transmission of the Torah was written down, after a certain period of time, that's it, we're closing it off. So you had different time periods that once those time periods were closed off, the present sages were not allowed to argue any longer with the previous ones, and the new generation cannot argue with the previous. And this went on to the Gaonim, to the Rishonim. Like the Rishonim, I'm sure some of you may have heard, a lot of the famous people are in the Rishonim period. You see, between the years of 1050 until 1450, great era. This is in the Sephardic. In the Sephardic in Spain, you had many people like Maimonides or Nachmanides, or you have Rashi that lived in Western Europe, you know what I mean? The Tosfos, all of those are known as the Rishonim. Rishonim, that's a time period. They never argued, not with the Gaonim, not with the Amoraim, not with the Tanoim. They just, the new laws now, the new things that apply to that generation, they had to come up with rulings, and they had to base it on predecessors, on the previous generation. Once we hit the year 1500 roughly, the era of the Rishonim were over, and right now from 1500 until now, 2018, we're considered the Acharonim, the ladders. Rishonim means the first ones, and Acharonim means the ladders. So you have the Tanaim, the Amoraim, the Gaonim, the Rishonim, the Acharonim, and now nobody can argue with a Rishon, or a Gaon, or an Amora, or a Tana. But today, if there's something that needs to be ruled upon, then the rabbis of today's generation, they have to use support of the previous generations. They can't argue with them. They have to bring them to support their claim in order to make a ruling, and then there's a vote and a rule is established. Ultimately, what I want to end off with is as follows. And this is sometimes very, very confusing in Judaism, and some of you might need to hear this in order to clarify the questions that you may have and why you came here to this class. And that is, when you look at the Code of Jewish Law, the Code of Jewish Law is a book of how a Jew is supposed to live his life. The problem with it is that in the Code of Jewish Law, you have everything written inside, the biblical commandments, in other words, those commandments that God instructed us that we have to keep. We also know that throughout the years, throughout the generations, and these were in the earlier years, there were prophets that established commandments to add to the 613. There are 7 commandments that were added because the rabbis accepted it, understood that this is what God wanted to instruct the Jewish people by, all of the Jewish people. It had to be accepted by everybody in the generation, and we have only 7. They're called Sheva Mitzvot de Rabbanan. We have 613 biblical commandments from God. 7 Mitzvot de Rabbanan, and I put, for instance, when you make a blessing before you're eating food, that's not a biblical commandment. God gives us a commandment that after we eat and are satisfied, we make a blessing. But before we eat, there's nowhere in the Bible does it say we're supposed to make a blessing. But what do we make? We make different blessings before we eat food. And what do we say? Blessed are you, God, our God, King of the universe, who commanded us Because these rabbis had the power, as we mentioned beforehand, when God said that you have to follow what the rabbis are saying. If they're coming up with a ruling, you need to listen to it. They came up with these 7 and they said, this is what God wants. Hanukkah and Purim came about from these prophets, from Daniel, from people, from Mordechai, from people that lived in that generation that says God wants this holiday observed. And when we take out the Chanukiah, we have to make the blessing, blessed are you God, our God, King of the universe, who commanded us to light the Hanukkah candles. Again, there are only 7 mitzvot Rabbanan. To us, those rabbinical commandments are just as the 613. However, in the Code of Jewish Law, there's more than just that. And that's where things get confusing. You see, throughout the generations, the rabbis also never imposed, since those 7, never imposed anything on all the Jewish people, but they might have made decrees. They might have made enactments. They might have instituted customs. And that becomes very, and they also said, this is ideally how a Jew should live. All of that is in the Code of Jewish Law. And you get very mixed up because you look in the Jewish law and in the Code of Jewish Law and says that one of the things that that it says in the Code of Jewish Law is that the Jew should not walk in public places while eating. And you think to yourself, what? You mean like you're not allowed to work on Shabbat, you're not allowed to walk in public eating a bagel? Seriously? It's the same thing? No, it's not the same thing. Because you need to look at the beginning of the sentence. It's befitting for the Jew not to walk in the streets while eating. It's befitting. It doesn't say mitzvah min haTorah. It doesn't say it's a biblical commandment. It doesn't say that this is a rabbinical commandment. It doesn't say tiknu chachamim, the sages enacted. It doesn't say gzeirah chachamim, that the sages made a decree. It doesn't say minhag, that this is a custom. It says yoyil. It's a good thing for a Jew. And that's how you differentiate, because I don't do everything that's written in the Code of Jewish Law. Every time you eat, you can't walk in public, you have to be sitting down, you shouldn't be taking bites inside your foods because it's unbefitting, to see your bite marks. You're God's ambassadors here. It's not nice for you to have these are all things that are befitting for us. So it's not a custom, it's not an enactment, it's not a decree, it's not a rabbinical commandment, and it's not a biblical commandment. It's just befitting. And that's important for us to understand. A kippah is a custom. It's not an enactment, it's not a decree, it's not a rabbinical commandment, it's not a biblical commandment. It's a custom. And a kippah is something that is not enforced upon you, it's a custom. You want to follow it, you don't want to follow it. You see, a biblical commandment and rabbinical commandment and even a rabbinical decree, those 3 to us are very important. Lower ones, they're iffy if you want to pick or not. And then there are also stringencies. That's another idea, stringency. So look what we find over here, and I just gave you like one example of each. You have the 613 commandments. Then you have the 7 rabbinical commandments. Hallel, blessings, hand washing before you eat bread. Eruv. There are 3 different types of eruvs that come from the rabbinical blessing. I'm not going to get into them right now. Shabbat candles, Friday night, is one of the rabbinical commandments. This is what God wants for you to light the Shabbat candles. It was a rabbinical commandment and it was said in that way, not as a decree. This is something God wants you. You should recite this blessing. Purim, Hanukkah, these are all the 7 rabbinical commandments. Then you have rabbinical decrees. Rabbinical decree is more about rabbis that would impose something. Again, it's not something that everyone in the generation had to accept. It's more regional. But many times, everyone ultimately accepted those decrees. The decrees were generally enacted. The decrees were generally, wrong word. The decrees were generally decreed as a preventive measure to sin. In other words, the rabbi saw that this might be a problem. People might sin. Therefore, they made a decree. So it's a preventive measure. That's a decree. An enactment, a takana, is normally they institute something to strengthen us in Judaism. Not to prevent us from sinning, but more to strengthen us. For instance, the Monday and Thursday Torah reading is a rabbinical enactment to keep us connected. It's not a decree. A decree normally, again, a decree, chicken is like meat. You ever heard that? That we have to consider. Why? Because you might make a mistake that one time you're going to see something, it's going to look like chicken, but really it's meat. And meat and milk you have to separate. But chicken, because it can look like meat, the rabbis made a decree that chicken you have to consider like meat or else you might make a mistake. So wine supervision. This was a decree. Why do we have to look at a bottle of wine and have a kosher symbol on it? What's wine? It's a cold press. It's grapes. Nothing is wrong with it. There was once a time period in which people used the wine for their idol purposes. And because of that, you're not allowed to use from that vat. You're not allowed to use from that manufacturing of that wine, because that's a commandment in the Torah that you cannot use nothing that is associated with idol worship. So the rabbis, again, made a decree in that region. It was Ashkenazic. But they made a decree and they said, from this point on, you have wine, you have to have a kosher supervision on it. Now today, maybe you can say, nobody goes and pours wine to their gods. But once a decree was established, we take it very seriously. Again, not like a rabbinical commandment, but decree is like number 3. So you have the enactments again. These are things that were instituted to help strengthen us as Jews. Customs, I wrote, like wearing a kippah. Stringencies, Chalav Yisrael. This was all, for those that know, there's sometimes, in other words, there's kosher dairy, and then there was one time in which people felt that, that the farmers are mixing in milk of pigs into the cow's milk because it was much thicker, more smetana, right? You know what smetana is, right? There was more cream. So they used to mix in the pig, and at that time, the rabbi said, it would be good if you take on a stringency that when you get something dairy, you make sure that it has a rabbi. It's Chalav Yisrael, a Jew had a part in that process of that milk. Now today, you don't really worry about it that much, even though Rabbi Nathanson, which is the OU head of the West Coast in Los Angeles, said there's still plenty of dairy farms that put in some pig's milk into the whole cow's milk production. So that's a stringency. Then you have ideal living, like not eating while standing in public. So a lot of times we have questions because we want to know where is it written. And sometimes you're right. You don't have to do it. It's not such a big deal if you don't do it because it's only a stringency. It's only a custom or it's only an enactment. It's not something as if you're violating something. But what you have to recognize is that there's biblical commandments, rabbinical commandments. You have decrees, you have enactments, you have stringencies, you have customs, and then you have ideals. And as we mentioned beforehand, the oral Torah was divided in 4 different levels of interpretation. And we kind of went through this. The pshat is a simple understanding. The remez, I told you that each of the words or each of the narratives, even the personalities of the stories, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they're all hinting upon something that's relevant to our lives. And then you have the drush, which is again the 13 methods in which we expound on the Torah. That's the drush level. And then you have the sod, like the Kabbalah, the mystical aspects of Torah. All are part of Torah. They're all part of the oral Torah. And that's what we have here today. So yes, you look at the Mishnah, you look at the Talmud, and it looks like thousands of rabbis are arguing with each other. They are. But did you ever stop to see what they're arguing about? They're not arguing about a Jew keeping kosher. They're not arguing about men putting on tefillin. They're not arguing about if women are supposed to light Shabbat candles. They're not arguing about that. That was all accepted. They're all arguing about hypothetical or things that are not, not cookie cutter exactly defined in the past, and they need to establish something now because this generation comes up to some new discovery that the rabbis have to make a ruling on. And that's the way the system has been, and the system is like that until today. And again, the acharonim of this generation can never argue with all those past sages. They have to use them as support, and then they take a vote, and that's the way we ultimately have the rulings of today, Shabbos elevators, or electric cars. Are you allowed to use them on Shabbos? You're not allowed to. All these things the rabbis go ahead and talk about, and they make a ruling on it, and we follow it because God said this is how we're going to establish the rules. And when they tell you, as we said in the previous page, in the very bottom, because that's important, if a matter is hidden from you, matters of dispute in your cities, you shall do according to the word that they will tell you, and you shall be careful to do everything that they will teach you. According to the teaching that they will teach you, shall you do. You shall not deviate from the word that they will tell you, right or left. So yes, we're bound to it. And that's, in a small picture, what the development of the Torah is all about. So, now it's the question time. Yes?
You say that wearing a kippah is a custom.
Yes.
Can you say a bracha without a kippah?
Oh, so people would not like to say a bracha without a kippah.
Well, if it's just a custom, what's...
It's not, you can't just, I'm minimizing it by saying a custom. So if a person does, there is also a concept that Minhag Yisrael is very, very important. A custom of Israel is very important. We know that it had gone back for hundreds of years in which Jewish people covered their heads. That we know for sure. I mean, I would like to say thousands of years, but at least I can prove for the last few hundreds of years. But if there was a custom that is as far back as we remember, that this is how Jews covered their heads, then today the very least is that if you're going to say something holy, that we try to put up a kippah. That's, is there a merit to do a mitzvah without wearing a kippah? I'm sure there's a merit, but we wouldn't think twice, but we would put on a kippah, even though it's just a custom. Yeah.
Where does modesty come in here? Like, what part of this would be modesty?
Modesty is probably more linked with the last of, this is ideal living, I would say. The married woman covering her hair is actually hinted in the Torah, in the biblical Torah. And there's a law of the suspected adulterous woman. A husband tells his wife that he sees her acting frivolous with a certain man and forbids her to be involved with him. He catches her again with him, and now he suspects foul play. So he believes that if she can openly violate him, that means that she is having an affair with him. So he brings her to the temple during the times of the temple. This is what it says in the Torah. You bring the woman there, and there's a process in which they take God's name and they allow it to be dissolved in certain water that is drawn from under the temple, and miraculously God's name is dissolved, and she drinks it. If she's telling the truth that she's innocent, nothing happens to her, and it says that, that the rabbis bless her and God blesses her because she was suspected from her husband falsely. But if she wasn't telling the truth and that she was actually having an affair, then that solution would actually explode in her stomach and she would die. In that process, it says you bring the woman to the Kohen and her covering of her head is removed, and then she takes the solution and drinks it. You see, that's the hint in the Torah that a married woman is supposed to cover her hair. Now, in terms of modesty, it says that a man should not dress with women's clothing. It doesn't say much more than that in the biblical. But there's always been a certain practice, again, customs more and more ideal the way the Jewish people have been, which means that there were certain customs in every single generation of how the Jews should present themselves and what's considered ideal and not ideal. Again, A woman that wears pants is not in violation, not of a biblical commandment, nor a rabbinical commandment, nor a decree, nor an enactment, none of those. It's all part of the ideal. It's an idealism of how that generation accepts, what the modesty code is. In today's generation, so it evolved to this point. It evolved to a point in which, everyone in the name of, being an Orthodox Jew has a certain code that they're wearing. But it's not necessarily, all black and white. In fact, a lot of the great leaders that lived 150 years ago, you saw pictures of their wife that today would be looked upon like, shocking, like, look at her V, she's like, she's too open. Doesn't she know to cover up the collarbone? That's today's generation. In other words, it's not. These were great rabbis' wives that that didn't have the coverings exactly the way this generation. This generation went very, very extreme, and the reason that this generation went very extreme is because the world went very extreme to the other side, and it's a natural reaction for the rabbis of this generation to say, to the religious Jews, you need to go the other extreme because there's too much immodesty and promiscuity in this generation. So that's how it came about. Yeah.
Are we allowed to say the Torah about in the presence of immodesty dressed woman?
Are you allowed to say? But yes, you're allowed to say brachot in front of an immodest. Yeah. Today, I understand something also is that you might find very, very religious Jews that that look upon secular Jews and judge them that they're not the way they're supposed to be living. We are part of Chabad, and the Rebbe that we look at as the leader of this generation. Nobody in this generation was as charismatic and knowledgeable and led this generation to bring back as many Jews as possible, like the Rebbe. And the Rebbe says we cannot judge anyone living in this generation. And that anything that this generation is doing is not doing it because they're looking to rebel against God. It's a lack of knowledge, it's growing up in a society, a culture, and that we have to look at every single Jew, that we just have to embrace them and to recognize that they're all just part of a family. So there is, you might have the Jews living in those ultra Orthodox communities in Jerusalem that will say they can't make a blessing in front of an immodest woman. Not in our circles. Not in our circles. Obviously, if a woman is completely exposed, or in I would say perhaps by a beach, where somebody's practically not wearing any clothing, there might be some question about it. But in general, if you're talking about a woman that doesn't cover her hair and shorts, we wouldn't even think twice. Yeah.
How are the boundaries between these generations of sages decided, established? The ones you just,
how they decided to establish that this is the end of a certain
for example,
period?
Rabbis of today, if you were just to decide, I want more for my rulings to be set in stone.
Right.
You say, okay, January 1st, 2019, we're starting the new generation. So
Right. Well, we are the Acharon. There's nothing after the ones at the end, afterwards. Acharonim means the end. That was it. Who established exactly at that time period? The rabbis of that generation decided that once all of the disputes were recorded and resolved, they wanted to close it up. So I would imagine that they gave that time period until all those matters that needed to be resolved were resolved, and then they say, that's it. We're closing it down right now so that it should not be able to be refuted later on. I would imagine that's the reason why. I mean, there was a good few hundred years in the Amoraim period, between the year a little over 200 until 500, almost 300 years. But once it was established and all of the rules, and they went through don't forget, the Talmud, there's like 20 huge volumes, and it goes through every law in the Torah. It's all based upon the Mishnah. The Mishnah are the laws based upon the 613 commandments. In other words, you have the 613 commandments in the 5 books of Moses. Then you have the Mishnah, which take all 613, and any questions are resolved. Then you have the Talmudic time period, which has to go through all 613 commandments based on the Mishnah. Once they went through that, it took them a very, very long time. Once they established it, and they already codified it, and they already printed it or written it down, that's it. It has to be closed off right now because they went through all of those. In fact, if you look at a Talmud, you'll find that the Talmud has it starts off with the Mishnah first, and then you have the Talmud afterwards, and then you have the Gaonim, or first the Sabarayim and the Gaonim are on the title page as well, included on that page, and then you have the Rishonim, which is Rashi and Tosfos, and that's your page of the Talmud. And then if you go in the back of the Talmud, you find the later sages. But in other words, there's a very clear distinction between the sages of previous generations and later generations. And to us, we look at that, it's the only way to safeguard it. You cannot allow anybody later on to argue with thousands of years ago, because then already everybody is going to be adjusting the Torah according to their view. So that's the way the system was set up. Yeah.
So we have 3 signs of a Jew. For the Jews, right?
We have what? We have what?
Shin, base, and
Tav.
Tav.
Yeah.
So we have Shabbat, we have Bris, and we have Tefillin.
Right.
3 signs. So
Correct.
why in all the lectures we never hear about Shabbat? Like, we mention about Shabbat, but we never say that people have to observe Shabbat. Because without observing Shabbos, where are we going to stand? That's like...
For today's Jew to keep Shabbat is a tremendous, tremendous undertaking. A tremendous, tremendous commitment. People work hard. It comes to a Saturday, they have their ideas of how they want to spend their day. Our approach has been for them to appreciate Judaism and for them to take it as comfortably as they want to take step by step. To come to them and say that, the first thing that they need to do is take in Shabbat, that's way too much of a commitment. And if you're going to give them that instruction, then that will turn them away, because you're telling me that my Saturdays, I cannot use the telephone, I cannot use the computer, it's way too restrictive. And trust me, everybody knows how the Orthodox and the traditional Jews observe the Shabbat. But to make that as if this is like the first entry that you need to accept the Shabbat, Jewish people are not going to accept it, and they won't listen to what you have to say. The idea of today's generation is for each one to take little baby steps in one area, something that they feel comfortable, something that they can embrace, something that they have a passion in, and slowly they'll begin to move in their own personal journey, and one day, eventually, they will. But we're not saying that we're not arguing with you. Of course, Shabbat is one of the great foundations of Jewish law, but it's you need to bring the Jewish people up to that point where they themselves can make that type of commitment. They have to be strong enough to make that type of commitment. It's a very, very hard, a very, very hard commitment. And kosher is another hard, to go ahead and change over your entire kitchen. But we hope that slowly you begin to recognize the journey of education and understanding the obligations of Judaism, that one day you'll be able to take on more and more commandments and more of the traditions of Judaism.
And if we'll go back to Torah's and principles, right, like Gizei Rashava, like comparison.
That's the drush. That Gzei Rashava is part of the
when they were
medrash.
established, why is it only like 16 or 17 that coming from is it only like 16 or 17 of them exist?
The what?
That Gizei Rashava.
How many Gzei Rashavas there
Yeah.
are? I don't know how many. I think there are far more than
And
that.
there are no new ones, right?
There are
It's all
the
ones from Moshe.
13 Shloshesrei Midot Shatorah Nidreshet. We say that every single morning. There are 13 methods. Gzei Rashav is one of the 13.
No, I'm talking about the Gizei Rashavas. There was only like 16 or 17.
I don't know exactly how many there are. Yeah.
So how do we, in our generation now, since we have like from, let's say, 200 years ago, when all the movement started, the different types of Judaism came
Right,
about.
correct, right.
So how do we approach that? Like, why then the Orthodox way is the right way?
Why did they start it? If you look back at history, you'll see exactly where it started. The whole Enlightenment movement, when it began in the 1700s, and you know what I mean. There were Jews that were living in Germany. You know, if you look at Jewish history as a whole, you can see a bigger picture, and you come to recognize that the Jewish people, they've been thrown out and persecuted and oppressed in every single country that they lived in. And when the Jewish people were, you know, had to leave, you know, when they left Egypt and they went into Israel, eventually the temple was destroyed. The first temple was destroyed, and the Jewish people were exiled in Babylonia, which is present-day Iraq. And they lived over there for a few hundred years until the birth of Islam in between 600 and 700 years. That's when Muhammad began to exist and began persecution and became unsafe for the Jewish people. That was right after the Talmudic time period, by the Savoraim and the Gaonim period. That's when the Jewish people start feeling like they have to leave Babylonia. Most of the Jewish people lived in Babylonia. A minority of the Jews lived in Israel, but most lived in Babylonia. When they felt it not safe any longer, so by the year 1000, then they all left Babylonia and they divided. Some of them went to Western Europe, which is England, Germany, and France, and then some of them went to Spain or Northern Africa, Morocco, in that area. That became then the period of time for a few hundred years. That was the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic. Now, all the rulings, all the enactments, and all the traditions and customs and stringencies were now, if you lived by the Sephardim, you had to follow the Sephardic. If you lived by the Ashkenazic, imagine that 90% of your ancestry were in Western Europe. What happened during the next few hundred years between the Crusaders, the Crusades that went through Western Europe, and they slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Jews, and the Jewish people up to the point till about 1500 years, about the year 1500, when Martin Luther, when Reverend Martin Luther like that persecuted the Jewish people, they felt already unsafe, and by the year 1500, most of those Jews that were living in Western Europe moved to Eastern Europe. Now, Eastern Europe, there was the king of Poland that basically had not just Poland like that, but Russia, Ukraine, all of that was under the king of Poland. And it was a newfound land, and he invited the Jews that were persecuted in Western Europe, come over here. So most of the Jews from Western Europe went to Eastern Europe. That's really where you can find all of our ancestry from. They left about the years 1500. We also know that the Jews in Spain were expelled in 1492, so they had to leave Spain. A lot of them moved back to Israel, but then they lived also in those communities in Morocco and all, wherever they can find a place to live. And Jews went to Turkey, the Jews went back to Iraq. I mean, there was a lot of Jews, but a lot of Jews went back to Israel, and in fact, it was the golden years of Tzfat happened in the next generation, because a lot of those Sephardic Jews moved to Israel, and they began to rebuild Jerusalem and Tzfat in the Holy Land. But the Jews that were living in Eastern Europe, that's what's called, that's where our ancestry, most of our ancestry are coming from. What happened then is that, what's known as Tach V'Tat, which is in 1648 and 1649, that's when Khmelnytsky with the Cossacks, they ransacked Eastern Europe, for those that know the history over there. And there was also a major bloodshed. 100,000 Jews were killed and slaughtered, and their monies were taken away, and they were exiled from their land. It was a terrible Holocaust in that time period. And that was the year 1648, 1649 in Eastern Europe. Afterwards, what ended up happening in the 1700s, in the late 1700s, all of a sudden, the Germans that the Jewish people ran away from to go to Eastern Europe, all of a sudden they told the Jews, come back. They realized that their economy is plummeting since the Jews left. Come back. They wanted the Jewish people to come back. So there was a group of Jews. They started off with 20 families, and these 20 families went to Germany, and they said, listen here. They told amongst themselves, this time we're going to get it right. We're going back to Germany. They're opening up their arms. So first of all of these stringencies and all of these customs and ideals like that, let's not show that out to the people. Let's show them, sometimes you wear the hat and the tzitzis and you're running around like that. Don't do that anymore. They're inviting us back. Let's not put the Judaism in their face. Let's just keep the commandments. That's how it started. We'll just keep the commandments and all those stringencies. So 20 families moved to Germany. And what ended up happening is that they began to show, Germany that, that Berlin is their Jerusalem and they're just like them. And they outwardly did not want to show their Judaism openly because that was the mindset. And they told their friends from Eastern Europe, and a lot of Jews began to, in the 1800s, come to Germany. And what ended with Moses Mendelssohn, there's a lot of talk about what they end up doing when the churches in Germany began with separate seating. So right away they said, we have to do separate seating. We did separate seating because the German churches started with family seating in the churches because they were trying to promote family. And because those Jewish people's mindset was, we need to do everything. It's not exactly against Torah anyway, let's go ahead and have family seating. Let's take off the divider and let's have the men and the women together. So they started rationalizing, it's not a commandment, it's not about, they started going that direction. What ended up happening within the next 100 years is that 250,000 Jews in Germany end up converting to Christianity because to be a good German citizen was to be a good Christian citizen. Their whole aim was to go ahead and become a good German. Don't show your Judaism. And if that's what Germany, that's what a good German citizen is. 250,000 Germans between the beginnings, the ends of the 1700s and towards the middle of the 1800s, 250,000 Jews converted to Christianity. What ended up happening, a lot of those Jews in the 1800s end up coming to America. Those German Jews. They didn't live in New York. They didn't live in Los Angeles. They went to the Midwest and they went all over. There was like 100,000 Jews that lived in America like in the late 1800s. That's all there were. But they were the German Jews. And the German Jews had a philosophy of that you need to be Jewish in your home, but on the street, you can't ruffle any feathers. That's what they were brought up with. So what ended up happening is that in the early 1900s, when out of Russia, when a few million Jews left Russia and they came into America, they were greeted by the leadership of those few 100,000 Jews that lived in America at the time. They greeted millions of Russian Jews that were all traditional, that had beards, that had tzitzit, that kept kosher. And when they brought them into America, they kind of gave them the rules. And America is not Russia. Over here, we have the policy of outwardly, we have to be like everybody else, American. Inwardly, you can be a Jew. So when the leadership is the one that's welcoming the new Jews, that's how a lot of the Jews followed. If you look at the pictures in the early 1900s, what's the typical picture? You see the Zayd and the Bub in the middle, looking like religious fellow, and then all the children around, the next generation like that, with the little spectacles, they look like doctors and lawyers and accountants. That's the typical picture. Why? Because that was the life of the Jews in America. And that ultimately influenced all the Jews that were coming into America, all those religious Jews. By the next generation already, that was it. Because that's what the influence is of leadership. If those few 100,000 Jews were very religious Jews, and they took in those religious, the Jews from Russia, then America would look different today. But that whole generation, from the early 1900s until 1950, the next generation, by 2 generations later on, that was it. The Jewish people became secular. And I can guarantee you, if you were to look back in your family, every single one of you, you go back 2 to 3 generations, every single one of you, not 90%, every single one of you had religious grandparents or great-grandparents. That's how it happened. And now, you can't blame that generation. This is what happened. And now we have to just bring everybody back. That's what Chabad is doing. That's what Chabad's about. And how it happened, that's how it happened. So once in America, they had that mentality, so they made synagogues based on that mentality. And then they started crossing lines. And what started off with Moses Mendelssohn, I want you to know, in Germany, He started of just let's take off the traditions, just take off the stringencies, just the enactments on the outside. But what that started eventually just snowballed into something out of control. And that's what we're facing today.
But all his kids converted.
What?
Christianity. All his kids converted.
That's right. His kids yeah. The B'nai B'rith that was established over here over 100 years ago in America. This is the leadership in America that established the B'nai B'rith. It's over 100 years old. They had a recent study, and they said like 92% of the descendants of the B'nai B'rith founders, children, great-grandchildren, are not Jewish. 92%. So how it happened is really not important, but it's what we do with it, at this point right now. And today, this is the generation. This is the way God wanted it. Nobody's to blame. This is already your third generation, and and today it's not as if the generation of Jewish people today are really looking to rebel again. They're not looking to deny. They just don't know. They don't know. They weren't raised with it. They don't have it, in their blood. But they begin to learn, and education is what's most important right now. And you take on little bits into your own home, and to ensure that the next generation feels a sense of connection.
One more question. Going back to oral Torah. So when the oral Torah was given, and we know what's happened with the golden calf.
Yeah.
Right? And Erev Rav sinned, and some Jews joined and everything. Was it actually not transmitted, like written, like the oral Torah, not written, because the other nations would actually know what says there, and they would act as Jewish people, right? And
Well, the golden calf is written in the 5 books of Moses.
No, I'm saying the golden calf. So we actually know about this in the Erev Rav.
Right.
And Hashem says that's your nation. He doesn't call my nation.
Right.
The Jews like you are my nation, but
Right.
but
Okay.
Erev Rav, it's your nation. You took them.
Right,
You
because
it's,
right.
It's,
They were the Egyptians that that joined the Jewish people.
that was like the reason why it wasn't like written.
It wasn't
It was to protect from the other nations to actually take it and pretend that we're Jewish too. And
Probably. I mean, that's what the given reason is that the nation should not take it and take the Torah to them, because that's, again, the beauty and the gem of Torah is the oral Torah, not the written Torah. The written Torah is very cut and dry. And that's why in today's generation, when a Jew that was not educated and looks at the Torah and says, this is the Torah that people sacrifice their lives for, there's not much inspiration in the Torah, because the inspiration is in the deeper dimensions of Torah, is in the interpretation, is in the understanding. It's seeing the relevance. When I get up in the synagogue every Saturday like that, it's always about taking the Torah portion and finding a relevance to our life today. And all of that is taken from the oral Torah. It's all about seeing the Torah portion in a different light, hearing how it's written about in the Medrash, and seeing a bigger picture and understanding how the message of that week's Torah portion is meant for me in my life today. That's what it's about. And today, if you don't look at the oral Torah, you're just looking at the written Torah, it's kind of primitive and immature. You know what I mean? It's almost like it's good for 5-year-olds. You know what I mean? But you get a little older, and you're looking at the written Torah. You don't find anything that's very valuable there. That's because the oral Torah has all of the gems of Torah. That all of the understanding of Torah is all found in the oral Torah. Yeah.
In today our time, so for example, how a Jews, let's say when we have a question, we know we're supposed to ask a rabbi.
Right.
So how does that work? Like, for example, why to follow the solution of that rabbi, not the other rabbi, for example?
Right.
One rabbi will say that on the same subject, another will say that.
Right.
The conservative rabbi will say this.
Because you're not asking the question in the realm of the biblical commandment or the rabbinical commandment. It's probably you're asking a question that falls into custom or falls in tradition or stringencies, and that it's not imposed on everybody.
No, for example, let's say the car on Shabbat.
Yeah.
So the Orthodox rabbi will say you're not allowed. The conservative rabbi will say you're allowed.
Again,
because it's not the fire. It's not exactly. It wasn't.
But a spark is a fire. So again, all the rabbis, the traditional rabbis, that when they're going to rule, again, they cannot argue in the past generations, they have to bring support. All of them, all Orthodox rabbis concluded that the creation of a spark is creating a fire. Fire is one of the laws of that you're not allowed to do. Again, you're asking about, let's say, Shabbat. I'll give you an example that we mentioned beforehand. When Moses told the Jewish people, this is a hint, this is one of the hints. Moses told the Jewish people that it would gather all together because I need to tell you all the instructions of all the works that you need to do for the temple. Right? Because they were going to build a sanctuary, and there were a lot of instructions of how to build a sanctuary, all the different vessels and all the different compartments and so on and so forth. As he's beginning to tell them and gathering them all together to give them all the works that they have to do to build the sanctuary, he starts talking to them about Shabbat. What's it doing there? That's right. So the oral interpretation is Moses told the Jewish people, when God said not to do work on Shabbat, which work did he mean? The ones that I'm telling you now of the construction of the sanctuary, those 39 works are the ones you're not allowed to do. So one of the works that they did in the temple, the sanctuary, was cooking, fire, creating fire. So that is something that from the oral tradition, Moses told us, that's what God means when he says, thou shalt not work on Shabbat. Those 39 prohibitive works that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. Now comes the question in today's generation. So when I put in a key in a car and I start the ignition, is that considered making a fire or not?
Yes.
Anyone, any Orthodox rabbi of this generation and the past generation said, of course that's a fire. That's a spark. That's the first point of a fire, is a spark. You're asking why the conservative rabbis say you're allowed to go to shul, you're allowed to go. Who said that? Where's your basis? What scriptures are you finding this permission on? You don't ask me the question, ask him the question. Ask the rabbi the question, how are you allowing people to go to shul on Shabbos? Now, if you look in the conservative, they have actually like a code of Jewish law. And in fact, if you look at why the conservative movement came about, and just give you something to look into, and I'm not going to go into the whole detail, but in America, the reform, what does it mean reform? They were reforming the Jews to become American. In other words, you're Jews, but the reform were going so far to the left that, and the Orthodox were keeping all the way to the right. Comes a new organization, we're here to conserve Judaism because the reform is going too far. So what they felt was that there has to be a middle ground. So that they told the Jewish people, and they said, listen, don't do everything that they allow you in the reform. For instance, a car you're not allowed to use on Shabbos, but to go to shul you're allowed to. In other words, they felt that if they're not going to deal with the reform, then the Jewish people are just going to eventually become assimilated. So their mission was to conserve. And probably initially they figured that probably it's okay by God as to make this permission to allow them to drive to shul on Shabbos, because at least they'll conserve in other areas of Judaism. But it's not founded on the principles that God established by us. And, God didn't say, but if there's going to be a threat in your generation, then you're allowed to do, A, B, and C. He's giving us the rules to follow. So the Orthodox tradition, don't step away from those rules, period. God says, of course, if it's a life and death situation, even not if life and death, even it has to do with the health of your body. You know what I mean? To violate your Shabbat. There's all these things written openly in Torah. But as a general rule, to go ahead and light a fire because, better me do that than to do that, that's human thinking. That's not the system that God has established. And that's why the Orthodox traditional Jews won't ever think about that, to drive a car on Shabbos, because it's considered making a fire. Making a spark is making a fire. There's no difference between the two of them. So that, that's what they, That's, it's them that need to answer. In other words, to bring them the system that was established for thousands of years and say, how come you allow, people to drive their car? It's a question that they have to answer, not me have to answer, because the system doesn't allow it. All right. Well,
Thank you.
all right, have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
And also, by the way, another book that I would highly recommend is the book called the Kuzari. I don't know if you ever heard of it or not, but these type of questions, and one of the questions about the development of the Torah, which is written there, it's in question and answer form. It's a fascinating story behind the whole Kuzari story, but that's something also for you to see, because this question is posed about the development of the Torah.